We're going to finish up the Die Brücke, who we were talking about last week. Why are you guys sitting so far back? I mean, really?
I want to sit there. There's coffee stains.
There's what?
Row.
There's what?
Yeah, I was just sitting there. There's coffee stains.
Well, no, I mean, you can sit all the way here. In the back, you can't see anything. You know, it's not like you're hiding. I know your names, right? I'll call on the people in the back to make comments. Lead them to water, but you can't make them drink. Okay, we were talking about the bridge, right? Die Brücke. That was a movement founded by Kirchner as an artist's colony of sorts. They were very, very close to each other. They studied together. They worked together. Kirchner had no real artistic training and seems to have exploited that to come up with a form of primitivism that was consciously attempting to look unschooled, attempting to look untraditional. And the color choices he makes are made with the express purpose of trying to violate your sensibilities, to shake you up a bit, to be consciously ugly. And that's a theme that we're going to see in modern art as we move our way through the century. Quite a few times where artists are doing something specifically to sort of shake you up and are consciously trying to make a difficult kind of visual statement, one that's not particularly attractive, that doesn't fall into the traditional ideas of aesthetics and aesthetics as a form of pleasure. And so his colors are jarring, and they are often lurid, super saturated, and oddly chosen, such as the pink in the sky in the Baltimore Museum of Art picture on your right, or the incredible red of that umbrella for the two women on your left, right? So again, Die Brücke, the bridge, and as we explained in class on Tuesday, this comes out of the philosophy of Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who believed that man's evolutionary progress was not complete, right? That evolutionary progress formed a bridge from our savage past to the present, and that we needed to recognize that there's still a bridge in front of us, leading to what he called the Superman, the Übermensch, right? And that only, Nietzsche said, only by recognizing the fact that we still have vestiges of that savagery in us, can we then get past it to move on to this next step, which is the Übermensch, the Superman, right? So we had to acknowledge the bridge to the past, acknowledge the unfinished nature of that progress in order to cross the bridge to the future, right? So it has that double meaning, bridge does. Bridge to the past. And for Kirchner, he wants us to look at the world around us and not be settled by it, right? Not be complacent within it, which is what aligns with Nietzsche's philosophy, right? Because Nietzsche's philosophy say, hey, Mr. Civilized Modern Man, you're still a savage, you know? And as we recognize that, we can then, move forward. And so Kirchner's work is doing exactly the same thing. He says, don't be complacent in your everyday world, right? See within that the vestiges of lack of civilization. And for Kirchner, it's the idea of traditional art training, right? There's our lack of sophistication, our lack of civilization, is uncivilized, untrained kind of artistic style, right? So it's hand in hand with that, okay? The group was fairly large and spreading, and as we saw at the end of class on Tuesday, Nolde joins in 1906, but he doesn't last very long. And in fact, I guess I should have those together, but I don't. He doesn't last with them very long. And part of the reason why is probably that he's less invested in that Nietzschean idea, right? That idea from Nietzsche of the past and the future. Right? At the same time, with both him and Kirchner, what we're looking for is trying to understand a path to a utopia of sorts, right? And that idea of using art as a way to move us from our world to a better place, which is at the word what Kirchner's doing, through those jarring images, to move us to a better place. That is at the heart of a lot of modern movements. That idea that art has the ability to affect your perception in a way that you can move to a nirvana, right? Use those exact words, but move to an enlightened space, enlightened place. So for Nolde, right, as we can see from looking, his style is not really that much like Kirchner's, although it tends to be a bit rough, right, heavy-handed, expressive. He tends to be very primitivist in some of his approaches, like the lack of gesso on the canvas on your right that we talked about. Right? But the subject matters are easier. These are easier on your eyes as well. The style is not as consciously ugly as Kirchner's. And the subject matter can go hand in hand with that. Cute little girls, woman planting flowers in their garden, right? And because he's not as in tune with Kirchner, and because he's not, I think, as sold on these ideas from Nietzsche, right, about the bridge, he only lasts with the group for about a year, right? So he joins him in 2006, the second year of the group. He stays only about a year. Goes off on his own. So both of these pictures are after Nolde has left Die Brücke. And in fact, we don't have any local collection works during the period he's there, right? So we can talk about him as a Die Brücke artist, but this is after he's divorced himself from the group, right? And all of that said, Nolde is, like Nietzsche, very much interested in using art as a vehicle for exploring the metaphysical world, right? Transporting us from our day-to-day into a better experience, right? He's as interested as anybody else this way, right? So one of the things that he became most famous for, Nolde did, is a series of works that are based on religion, and in particular Christianity. I'm sorry this is blurry. I've never seen this in person, so this is an old National Gallery picture that's gotten all gray. On my computer screen it looks fine, but you get it up here and all of a sudden it's all blurry, so I'll see what I can do about that. But it's a watercolor on paper of one of the apostles on the day of Pentecost. Right? So if you know your Bible, the day of Pentecost is 50 days after Easter, and it's the moment when the Holy Spirit descends to the apostles who have gathered in an upper room. Right? This is the gift of the Holy Spirit that Christ promised before he died. And so a dove descends, the sign of the Holy Spirit, descends on the apostles, and they immediately reach a sort of feverish state where they start to speak in languages they themselves do not understand, what the Bible calls other tongues. Right? They speak in a language that none of them understand, that is meant to be the language of heaven, the language of the Holy Spirit. Right? This happens on Pentecost. So our image here is this blissed out saint, right? Having been filled with the Holy Spirit, being given the potential to do something extraordinary. Speak in a language they'd never learned. Right? And if we think about it in the grand Nietzschean scheme of things, it kind of makes some sense, doesn't it? Here's the guy that's moved to this next spiritual plane from normal existence. But at the same time, Nolde's left Die Brücke behind. And he paints not only these images like this of faces of saints, but he does religious images as well, mostly derived from Judeo-Christian traditions, mostly New Testament images. But he's not intending them to be Christian images. He wants to see something more in them than just that. He wants that religion, which, in cultural studies, we talk about Christianity and other religions as being sort of mythologies, right? And these mythologies reveal something about us. It's where we often put our collective anxieties and thoughts and aspirations take manifestation in these mythologies, right? And they can be anything from Thor, Mary, to Christ, right? Shared mythologies, to Beowulf, And if we look at the themes that are treated in these, they then reveal something more universal about us as humans. So, and this is how Nolde is approaching Christian imagery. It is not as something that is meant to only inspire the devout and comfort the Christians and make them feel good. He doesn't see that way at all. He sees it as a more broadly universal theme that everyone could benefit from. And he started doing these after having been incredibly sick. He drank some poisoned water, right? Some non-drinkable water, and he laid with a fever for weeks, and by his own account had visions, right? Fever dreams and whatnot. And that's when he started to do these Christian images, right? Was based on these sort of visionary experiences he had while deathly ill. Got him into doing these. And these are the things he's best remembered for, are these. Yeah, Lane.
Do you have any idea which apostle is this?
I don't think he cares that much, right? Because for him, it's, again, just as he's divorcing the Christian theme from Christianity to make it more universal, I think it would be less important for him to have it to be any one of them in particular, right? There are no defining characteristics here, right? So if it were, in fact, Saint Paul, for example. Actually, it wasn't there. Think of someone who was there. Saint Matthew. There might be something that would be define him as having been Saint Matthew, right? But there isn't. So, right. He's not really being dogmatic about it. He's not trying to illustrate the Bible. He's trying to illustrate something much more profound than that, if you will. Something much more universal than that. Right? But again, this is all after he's left Die Brücke behind, right? But I think it ties into those ideas still. I think there's something very similar about that still going on. Another of the original group in 1905 was Max Pechstein, or Pechstein. And a lot of these are these more recent gifts to the National Gallery. The promised gifts from the Saltzman family that really rounded out our collection of expressionists, because we really didn't have very much prior to that. But you can see that Pechstein is, unlike Nolde, is much closer to Kirchner in style. The figures have a sort of rough, primitive nature to them. The colors are super saturated and lurid. I think the application of color is not like Kirchner. We saw Kirchner with the palette knife. We saw Kirchner, or I talked about it, we didn't actually see one, where he's squeezing the paint right from the tube onto the canvas, right? Really but these are painted, And whereas Kirchner gave us these nudes under a parasol, looking at us kind of confrontationally, here we have bathers, or summer day. They suggest bathers in that they are in various stages of undress. Right? At the same time, there's no water really suggested anywhere, right? We're just sort of sunning ourselves, if we were, in this picture, joining them. Does it remind you of anybody, sort of the thematic choice that we've looked at? The Joy of Life, or other things by Matisse, right? Now remember I brought this one in because I think I had Joy of Life to begin with, so yesterday's PowerPoint, or Tuesday, had Joy of Life here, and I decided, this one's a better example because of the thematic choices, right? And one wonders the degree to which Pechstein and Matisse, if there's not some connection here, right? Now we know that a lot of critics, and this is now 5 years after he joined Die Brücke, okay, the one on our left, because he joined in 1905, that's 6 years after. He joined in 1905, and stayed, unlike Nolde. Critics looking at their works were always saying, aren't you guys doing the same thing as the Fauves? Isn't your style indebted to the Fauves, right? And this really rubbed Kirchner the wrong way, and we talked about this, right? He would redate his paintings earlier to show, right, that he was first. And when he wrote, he wrote a story of the founding of Die Brücke, right? And you can read it, but he says that he started it in 1902, which there's no evidence for whatsoever, right? And again, with the idea that he wanted to try to demonstrate that their ideas were utterly independent from the Fauves. And all that makes me think that they were dependent on the Fauves. Otherwise, why not just be comfortable and say, we're independent and deal with it, right? Try to prove something, unless you're really trying to lie about it, right? Which he's doing anyway. So with Matisse, right, the color choices, and again, Matisse's colors are so vibrant, right, so rich and vibrant, even though this late pointillist style of early Matisse is not picked up at all. The thematic choice is, and I think there's a difference in a way, though, because for Matisse, even with the title, and what he says about art, he's trying to evoke a golden age of harmony, right? Figures in harmony with the landscape. And even though it's a relatively modern scene, we have a masted sailboat in the background, right? We see as Matisse develops through pictures like The Dance and, as Hunter said, The Joy of Life, right? That what Matisse is suggesting is a sense of sort of perfection, right? That's what the Golden Age is all about, right? Is a period when everything was in perfect harmony. And the title suggests that as well, right? Luxury, calm, and voluptuousness, sensuousness, right? This suggests a harmony. But that's not what the bridge artists are trying to do. They're trying to use these images to jar us, to suggest a sort of disharmony. And there certainly is an interest in primitivism here, right? That's part of the Nietzschean philosophy, is that you're reaching back to a primordial past. But for the Die Brücke, when you find that primordial past, you're sort of wanting to reveal the lack of civilization, right? The lack of sophistication, the lack of modernity, if you will, right? But when Matisse goes back there, that's not what he's looking for, right? He's trying to re-evoke a modern golden era, right? Whereas Pechstein, Kirchner are trying to reveal a modern savagery that still exists, right? So there's great similarities here, but there's also these differences that really highlight these two different movements very strongly. Another Pechstein down in Richmond, again, bathers. I don't think that's all he did. It's just luck of the draw here in this region that we happen to have two separate works that seem similar thematically, right, from Pechstein there. But again, I think when we look at the style, if we look at the rather ugly face of the woman facing us in the lower left corner, mask-like and frightening, we can think of Kirchner, and we can think of these ideas of the fact that under the veneer of modern sophistication, modern life, right? The developments of the modern world. Underneath that veneer is, in fact, a link back to this shared primordial past, which is one that is not a golden age, right? And that we need to continue to try to evolve away from, right? Now, by the time he paints this, both of these Pechsteins that we saw, Pechstein had moved to Berlin. So remember that the Brücke group started in Dresden, right? And remember that Germany had multiple artistic centers, not just one like France, one primal one, right? Multiple artistic and thriving artistic centers. And Pechstein begins as part of this group called Die Brücke in Dresden, but in 1908 he moves to Berlin. And eventually the rest of the group will follow him, right? But he's kind of the link that migrates this group from Dresden to the larger city of Berlin. And in Berlin, Pechstein meets Otto Müller, right? Name is spelled exactly the same as the council who's investigating, right? The special investigator in D.C. Müller, M-U-E-L, right? That's what the umlaut means. There's an E missing, right? Otto Müller. Pechstein meets Müller, invites him to join the group, right? And this is all in Berlin. And so Müller, only after 1910, becomes part of Die Brücke as well. And that's when Pechstein meets him. And you can see that he's kind of thematically similar, right? Again, bathers. Now we don't have any place for them to bathe, kind of like the Summer Day by Pechstein that we just saw. But there are these figures that are in this primordial forest, right? The forest primeval, as you might say, right? And on a certain level, it does seem, somewhat closer to this idea of a peaceful coexistence. But we add into that the very primitive way in which Müller attempts the figure, right? They end up looking like carvings that you might see from the East Indies, totems, right? Non-Western, non-European tribal carvings in the way that he treats the figures. And there's a sense with all of them that there's a sort of, he understands anatomy, but he's choosing not to illustrate it clearly, right? And so what we see, I think, with his works is and maybe more so than Pechstein, is a sense of primitivism. And this is one of those overarching ideas that we see in lots of different artists' works toward different ends. We talked about it with Picasso, a certain sense of primitivism, where he becomes interested in works of art that are seen to be, in themselves, the product of a primitive culture. And that can mean a culture from the past, or it can mean in a very colonial mindset. It can mean from a culture that's not as well developed as Europe, or seen as not as well developed as Europe, right? A primitivism. And Müller is most definitely practicing that. So Pechstein wants us to look through the veneer of the modern age to see a primitive past, but Müller wants to just show it to us. Here we are, right? Cavemen, if you will, right? People wandering, and there's not the sense that they've dropped their clothes, like Pechstein's Summer Day, for a quick sun when no one's looking except Max Pechstein. Rather, that these are figures that haven't yet developed the use of clothing. They haven't figured that part out yet. That makes it really primeval if you think about the great mythology of Adam and Eve, right? They're pre-lapsarian, they're before the fall, even though they're not intended to be seen as particularly religious figures, right? So this is, again, it kind of like a golden age, kind of like Matisse that way, but not really, because the point is their primitivism, right? The point is where they are, rather than a place we want to go back to, a place we want to distance ourselves further from. There it is. I should have that in my notes. That's it in a nutshell, right? For Matisse, when he looks to the past, it's a place to go back to escape the modern world, right? To find something we've lost. And for the bridge, and for all the artists we've looked at, when we look back at the past, it's not a place to embrace. It's not a place to seek refuge in. It's a place to distance yourself further from, right? To get out of there, to realize that's kind of who we are, it's part of who we are, but to say we've got to keep moving, right? It's like halftime, and you're looking back and you're saying, oh, we didn't do this, we got to do this, we're going to win, right? I was intrigued. I don't know if I really want to go this direction because I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go with that. But I was intrigued with the sort of Cezanne connection. We've talked a lot about Cezanne and the importance of Paul Cezanne for modern art, especially in the first part of the 20th century. He did a series at the last year of his life. Cezanne died in 1906. In the last year of his life, he produced 3 massive pictures. And they're huge. This is in Philadelphia. Have we seen this one yet? I think we cut this one out of what I was going to show you before. But he did 3 of these. One's in London, one's Philadelphia, and I forget where the third one is, right? Of bathers. And he'd been working on this theme for 25 years, right? Since about 1880 or so. He's been doing various things of bathers. And for him, he's also very much interested in this idea of a perfect age, trying to re-evoke a perfect age. And there's just something about the way in which with Müller, excuse me, he paints the figures in the same basic tonality as the trees. How it's kind of a monochrome piece around that skin tone that he's using. And if we look at Cezanne, this is an amazing picture when you think of the risks he's taking as a 19th century painter, really. Right? And the way in which the figures sort of meld with the background forms. Right? They're one with nature. Right? But again, the difference is that Müller wants us to get past this, whereas Cezanne seems to use this as a way of linking his works to the great traditions of art, but in a very, very modern way. That's a fascinating picture. I mean, it's just, the more you look at it, the more you realize, geez, how did he get away with that? What's going on with this woman's back that seems to grow out of that woman's head? What's going on with the back of her? So there's her shoulder. And you get the sense that it used to be there, but the color between the trees, which he painted later, comes down and just obliterates it. And then you go like, well, I wonder if Delaunay's work looking at him, as he's talking about color that obliterates the figure, sound that obliterates the figure, right? This hunched figure here that just really melted. You don't see it at first because it's melted into the background. It's such a thing. There's her hair. Where's the head? Right? It's melded into the figure behind it. They're really, what's going on in the pond? Is there somebody swimming out? And why is that guy with the horse in the background? Then little things that are just very mysterious. Well, Müller is, I think, people knew Cezanne. Right? We talked about that with Picasso. People just knew who he was. He was on everybody's radar screen. And as Picasso said, he's the father of us all. He's the father of modern art. As much as any painter could claim that title, and everybody's looking at him. I think Müller's one of them as well. Right? So one of the things we've been talking about as we looked at modern art is how these different movements feed on each other, right? How they trickle down through the course of the 20th century. And there are certain people that we're going to keep coming back to, And what we're going to see is, of course, Picasso will be one of them. But Picasso looks back at Cezanne. And Cezanne remains, at least in the first part of the 20th century, this touchstone for artists. Because of the choices he made that were extraordinary even in their own time. And remained extraordinary even past his death. Right? So Müller... certainly picking up on Cezanne, and not the only one to do so at this time. At the same time, the angularity of the figures, even though there's a brusqueness to how he's putting down the paint, seems to owe a little bit to Cubism as well. So, especially the pelvis of one of the figures on the right, but you start to see these angles and the reorganization of the figure in sort of cubic forms. Owes something to Cubism as well, and we'll look more into that as we look at things. down in Richmond as well. I've not seen this in person, so the colors may be a little bit more lurid here, but certainly Kirchner is a very lurid painter. Kirchner moves up to Berlin as well, right, in 1911. And here's a painting of Otto Müller, right, in the guy with the big booty, right, is our painter here, and Masca is his wife, and she's probably the model for these figures multiple times over. That was fairly common. Even Monet did the same thing, posed his wife multiple times for these. And she was, in fact, we know, his favorite model. But here they are in Kirchner's studio. So this idea of the bridge, the Brücke, that began in Dresden really does transport to Berlin by 1911, right? They break up by around 1913 and really all go their separate ways, right? And we'll look at that coming up next. Let's see what we have coming up next, right? So everybody's here, again, very, very tight-knit. This is why we've got a painting of Otto Müller by Kirchner. On arriving in Berlin, Kirchner's works also, you can see some cross-pollination here. You know, the angularity of the figures that we see in Müller, even though this is a later picture, Kirchner's getting more angular as well during this time. Where the figures don't look at all like those earlier ones, which were glumpy, you know, amorphous, nebulous, right? Plastic-like, rubbery. Now they're much more angular and spindly. Definitely intended to be prostitutes walking down the street. The two women in the foreground on the left, surrounded by all of these men who are some watching them, some not. The guy window shopping there. But you'll notice that even the window shopper is sticking his cane out behind him as if he's going to stop them, you know, trip them up a little bit, make some furtive contact, which is probably the, you know, I don't know from how to proposition a prostitute on the street, I don't know. But one would think that you strike up some sort of physical contact, you go from there, right? And he's got his cane behind him, right? And you can see that even though he's looking down this way, there's something about that eye that suggests that he's kind of looking over his shoulder as well, right? But the style here has changed, hasn't it? To the point where you can suggest that he's very much aware of the Young Ladies of Avignon by Picasso, right? It has that Cubist similarity. And this is why when we talk about Cubism, right, as a movement, we really talk about the Cubist revolution in 1911, right? When Picasso and Braque start putting out those analytic Cubist pieces, modern art changed, period, right? More so than maybe any other development in the first quarter of the 20th century. Modern art changed because of Cubism. And people started painting differently across the field, right? Orphists are Cubists, really, right? That whole movement that we looked at for a week, they're Cubists. The Futurists are Cubists, right? And by this point, even Die Brücke is becoming Cubist after the great Cubist revolution, right? So it's really everywhere. There's a nice little crayon drawing down in Richmond by Kirchner, where again, even though he's moved into this Cubist style, you can see that he's looking at the makeup of these prostitutes as he does this evocation of them. And what he's focusing on is the artificial face paint, you know, the lipstick and the rouge, right? The facial colorations is what he's focusing on. And I think he's sort of saying, you know, this is the old comment, you can't put lipstick on a pig, right? And call it something else. What he's saying is that despite the makeup and despite the fancy clothing, there's still this savage past that you really can't cover up, right? Through its ugliness. Well, let's see. He served in World War I. Kirchner did. Almost all the artists we're going to be looking at this point served in the war. Kirchner goes off to the war. He suffers a mental breakdown while in the war and has to be committed to an insane asylum for a year, right? A sanitarium for a year to recuperate from the mental breakdown he suffered on the front. Germany was our enemy during the war. So when we talk about these guys and be sympathetic, I'm not thinking about politics. I'm thinking more about just the humanism of the event, right? After the war, he was apparently he never really recovered from that experience. And there's a later Kirchner from the 20s. Still the same sense of color. I really quite like this picture, actually. A visitor coming to his studio upstairs. So we're looking down the orange stairs to see him coming up to this, under the rafters up above, with his maid or maybe his model or maybe his wife. I'm not 100% sure, coming to visit him. He's laying in bed smoking a pipe. Right, so that's Kirchner in the background. The thickness of the wall, the separation from the outside world indicated not only by that thick wall but by the stairs leading down. And then the floorboards of this attic sort of tipped down flat, right, in front of you. But I do like the little camel decorations on the side of his daybed, are really kind of cute. But they're, again, very Kirchner colors, right? And I wanted to read you something as we looked at this picture because somebody in 1917, so it's 5 years even before this, described coming to see Kirchner in his studio, right? So there's a visit to Kirchner's studio. I'm going to read this to you. I found him sitting on a very low chair next to a small hot stove in a yellow painted sloping roofed attic. He's painted the interior yellow as well, right? And probably not a happy yellow, right? A very Serbic yellow. Only with the help of a stick was he able to walk, staggering around the room. A colorfully painted curtain concealed a large collection of paintings. When we began to look at them, he came alive. Together with me, he saw all his experiences drift by on canvas. And the small, timid-looking woman set aside what we had seen and brought a bottle of wine. He made short explanatory remarks in a weary voice. Each picture had its own particular colorful character, and a great sadness was present in all of them. What I had previously found to be incomprehensible and unfinished now created the same delicate and sensitive impression as his personality. Everywhere a search for style, for psychological understanding of his figures. When I was leaving, I thought of Van Gogh's fate and thought that it would be his as well sooner or later. Right? Well, Van Gogh killed himself. Right? And Van Gogh is also like we think about tracing this back to the seeds, right? Van Gogh is another seed, definitely, right? Only later will people understand and see how much he has contributed to painting. Right? And I found that he's there, he's frail, he can barely get around until he starts to talk about his paintings. And then it's there, it's his life, right? Van Gogh's fate, Kirchner killed himself too, sadly. In 1937, the Nazis confiscated over 600 of his paintings and drawings, right, out of museums all over Germany. Hitler mounted a show called the Degenerate Art Exhibition in 1937 to try to show people how bad art had got, so that they would, like him, hate this stuff. And at the same time, across town, he had an exhibition of great German art, right? Which is all the stuff Hitler liked. And the stuff in the Degenerate show was kind of poorly hung. You can see the picture on the back wall is cockeyed, right? It had wall labels that were racist, talked about how blacks are becoming the N-word, or how Germans are becoming the N-word, right? It's horrible. And all the people who like modern art queued up to see it, right? And it became a huge hit, simply because everybody realized what was going to happen next. As soon as the show was done, they burned it all, right? And Kirchner had 25 works in that show that were all burned by the Nazis. He killed himself the next year, right? So one of the things that's going to come up again and again as we're looking at works of art from the early 20th century is that what happens in the 30s in Europe, right? With Hitler, with Mussolini, right? The rise of the fascists is one of the things that's spelled a death knell for modern art. Like almost brought it to a dead stop, because Hitler doesn't like art that challenges you to think individually. And that's what modern art does, right? The whole point of modern art is that all of us can look at this thing, and I'm telling you one thing, this is what I think about this stuff, but really there's so much going on in this when we lose the reference to recognizable physical world. That means Seth can look at this thing and say, I don't agree with anything Trowbridge says, I think something else is going on there, right? And if it's something that is absolutely, totally abstract, like Delaunay, right? You could go even further with that. Say, this is where I think this is headed. Because the point is that abstract art, modern art in general, is humanist in the most pure sense possible, in that it celebrates individual humanity. It asks Mary and Jude and Hunter, to each of you, you got to bring something to this. And what you've got to bring with it is every bit as important as what the artist has brought to it. And that's a wonderful thing about it, is that challenge. Now, if you're Hitler and you want people walking in lockstep, everybody doing exactly the same thing, this is problem, isn't it? Right? Is this idea of free thinking. This is why fascists, when they get in trouble, often will close institutions of higher learning. Right? They'll close universities because we're trying to do the same thing. Right? To get you to think about these things, not just accept it. Right? So we're going to move from there now to our other major modern movement under this umbrella of expressionism. We looked at some outliers as well with Katie Kollwitz, but we're going to look at a group in Munich under Vasily Kandinsky. So we're lucky to have some really beautiful Kandinskys in the area. And Kandinsky is the artist who is credited, for right or for wrong, as being the first artist to really push beyond representation, to come up with a picture that has no direct relationship to the observed world, to the physical world. He's credited with this. Now, whether or not that's true is another issue, right? But that's the point. And he ends up in Munich. He's from Russia originally. His name might tip that off for you, with a name like Kandinsky. He's from Russia. And he moves to Munich in the 1890s, which is where he spends the next 20 years, up until World War I breaks out. And as an expat, he has to go back, right? He goes back to Russia during the war. So we're going to look at Kandinsky up to the war, up to 1914, and talk about this early career in Germany, right? And he goes back, by the way, after the war. Now, we've already seen that right around 1911, 1912, there's a lot of artists that are doing non-representational works. Kupka is painting sound, right? Delaunay is painting sound. And this idea of trying to translate something you cannot see into visual form is also at the heart of what Kandinsky is trying to do. He too says that he's painting sound. Right? We'll look into that more. So what we're going to look at with Kandinsky is how he got here, right? How do we end up at a work of art that seems to have no representational value whatsoever, but seems primarily to be form, although we'll see it does still have some, right? He starts off as a sort of post-impressionist, symbolist painter in the 90s and early 1900s. This is the only early example we have in a local collection, but even here we can begin to see some things that for Kandinsky are incredibly important. One is thematic choices. The figure on horseback. In this case, simply riding on a path through the trees. But we're going to see this theme as a theme, to be a theme that Kandinsky returns to again and again and again. The mounted rider is, for him, a metaphor for something greater. And it runs through his career rather consistently. It's not in every picture. I'm not saying that at all, but it is something that we see often. The other thing that we see already in 1903 with his work in the Krieger is that Kandinsky is choosing colors not for their representational value, In other words, the sky isn't blue. The grass isn't necessarily green. It's not for its representational value. He's choosing colors for other reasons. And eventually, by 1910, 1911, he explains this for us, which is nice. He wrote about it. He told us why he was choosing colors and what effect he hoped those colors would have on you, the viewer. Right? So he explains his non-representational choices of color. But what we'll see as we get to that point where we talk about what he wrote, what we see is that of the colors, blue is by far the most important, because he associates blue with spirituality, a very profound and deep metaphysical nature to blue. And part of this comes, of course, from the sky, right? His use of color symbolisms often have to do with deriving it from where one sees it in nature anyway, but then thinking what its true value is. So there's that, but there's also the use of blue in religious art through the centuries, through the millennia. Blue as a color. Think of all the Virgin Marys you've seen in blue, coming from Russia, where they produced icons against gold backgrounds of the Virgin and Child, right? Simplified human forms, where the color becomes an important part of the message, right? That's Kandinsky's heritage, and so he brings that into his pictures as well. Right? He's a painter. He's also a printmaker. And here we see another of the horseman images in a wood block. I'm sorry this has gotten kind of grainy as it gets blown up. The horsemen are more than just horsemen. They are meant to be knights, soldiers on horseback. But not contemporary soldiers so much as traditional or medieval soldiers, which makes them, in many ways, crusaders. Soldiers fighting for spiritual truth, right? Crusaders taken in a positive way, which is kind of hard to do in the modern world, right? But the idea of fighting for something that you believe to be a spiritual truth, right? And this is what Kandinsky imbues images of horsemen with. So in this case, they even have, either helmets or traditional Russian hats on. As they gallop toward the left, the city in the background, there's a figure in the lower right corner kneeling as they ride by her in prayer. Russian folklore remains a really strong element of Kandinsky's agenda, right? These old traditions that he will find modern voice for. Another early woodcut, and again, having come from Russia to Munich, we see a lot of old Russian motifs even while he's in Munich. So we have a very Russian Orthodox church in the background, looking like the one on Red Square, right? St. Basil's. Is that what you were saying? Yeah. And then these figures in the foreground, which are really quite wonderful. These women in these amazing clothes, right? The one looking out and smiling at you, and keeping in mind that he came out of this sort of symbolist movement of the 90s. That's when he gets to Munich, is the height of international symbolism, and there's something about these women in fine clothes that reminds us of Pandora, right? Of your standard femme fatale motif that we saw coursing through different symbolist works, right? So Kandinsky's moving forward now in working in multiple media. And what we're seeing with these two monochrome woodcuts is certain thematic issues that will remain important for Kandinsky. His Russian heritage, Russian folklore, as well as the theme of the knight, right? The theme of the armed soldier, right? In 1913, he publishes a book of poems and woodcuts called Sounds. The German word is Klange, K-L-A-N-G-E, which I think, if I remember from when I took German, and it's been a while, right, is not just sounds, it's also noises, right? Klange, clang, right? I think that's where we get our word clang, is from the German word Klange,
which is noise. And it's a series of 56 woodcuts, some of them in color, right, with tone blocks as well as the line block. And he started working on these in 1907, right? The woodcuts date that early. And then he wraps up the project 1911, 1912. He does the majority of the woodcuts, more than 50 of them in that last year, 1911, 1912. And then it's published in 1913. So he's kind of done with it, right, by 1912 before it actually comes out in publication. And there are 56 woodcuts. There are also 38 poems that he wrote. Now, they're not rhyming poems. They're prose poems, right? And looking at sounds, we get a hint of what Kandinsky's trying to do. This is really a great introduction to what Kandinsky's trying to do. And as a printed book, even in a small run, there are multiple copies, right? That's the beauty of printmaking, is you get multiple copies. So the Phillips has one, the Baltimore Museum of Art has one as well. And there may be more around, I know those two for sure, right? You have to ask to see it, but they'll show it to you if you do, right? You make an appointment and they'll bring it out for you, okay? So in this case, landscape with figures, we see, again, maybe Russian folklore, sort of Christianity coming in, but again, like Nolde, it's not Christianity for its own sake, right? It's as a symbol for something greater, something more universal. So we have a cross on the horizon behind us. We have a figure coming in from the left-hand border. We see this figure down below that looks like they're sitting up, maybe, right? We don't see their legs, but there's this sense kind of having risen up, bent at the waist, and then directly behind it, another horseman. See that? Moving through the landscape, just underneath that orange shape, right? So figures in a landscape is one of these prints. As we look at both the prints, here's another page, right, mountains, and the images, this is a wonderful piece. This is fantastic. I'm right. Look, Ma, no hands, right, on horseback. Figures on multiple horses here, figures standing in, and the sense with the arms out to the side of just sort of reveling in nature, like just, absorbing it all. And this one without any line block, it's just the color, right? But both the poems and the pictures do the same thing. And that is that they repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. In the poems, a single word. In the pictures, a certain motif. And they repeat it so much that it starts to drain the traditional meaning out of it. So if you say one word enough, right, it starts to be a sound instead of the word. This is the idea of a chant, right? Of a mantra that you might chant, is that your mantra, the word that you say, it doesn't mean anything. It's a sound that resonates with you, right? Have you ever had that happen? I've had this happen writing, okay? And I write a word, and all of a sudden I just look at it, and I think that's just wrong. It's like fog. It's just somehow seen, and I can't be misspelled. It's 3 letters, but it doesn't look right to me all of a sudden, And that's what Kandinsky. So the poems will take a word, it's repeat it, and then at a certain point it just becomes a sound, right? And because you're reading it instead of hearing it, it becomes a sound that you hear with your spiritual hearing. Does that make sense? Rather than your sensory hearing. Because you're reading it, not hearing it. Right? And the pictures, by repeating the same motifs again and again, you start to, what Kandinsky hopes will happen is that it will stop being a horseman and start having some other greater meaning of a figure transcending the physical plane. And that's why in these pictures so often, we'll see this, and it's actually in both of these already, mountains figure into it. Ascent, away from the plateau to a higher plane. Horsemen riding up the hill as a metaphor. And as he repeats them again and again, what happens is the words are supposed to have this
sonorous effect on your psyche, right? He calls it spiritual vibrations. Yeah, they have a spiritual, they vibrate with your spirit. The images, as he repeats them, get more abstract. So he'll repeat the forms again and again. Each time he'll step a bit further away from trying to make it recognizable. But the elements are still there. So the pictures work in the same way, that he starts to see them as just forms that become part of a composition, that stop referring back to our world and instead refer to this spiritual vibration that he thinks both art and sound can have, right? Art and words can have. So let's look at horsemen, okay? So here's two of the pictures from sounds. And remember that he did these over the course of 4 or 5 years, right? And I'm not going to, interesting thing about Kandinsky is it's not like it's a single directional path from representation to abstraction, right? That's not the way Kandinsky works. He's always stepping back and forth. So these are not coming up in chronological order. What they're coming up in is order of abstraction. Does that make sense? So it's going to look like I'm running us through time, but it's not the case. We're just going to pass. So, two horsemen against red. Again, the interesting colors. We'll talk more about that as well. But you can start to see with the horseman on the right that the horse is becoming more of an abstract shape, right? Increasingly divorced from observed reality. What did I just do? Hang on a second, I just did something crazy here. To my view. Sorry about this, guys. Hey, I have now done something. I don't know what I've done. I'm in a different view. Let's just do this, see what happens. Yeah, okay. Lyrical on the left takes that abstraction a step further. It's still a horse and rider. I think you can still make this out very clearly. But the horse is starting to break down into a series of lines and colors and shapes that, if you were to divorce the head from it, becomes more difficult to read, right? Things are becoming increasingly divorced from reality. Not all of the woodcuts are colored. Some are in black and white, but this one, called Riding Path, meant to be a figure riding along a path, is also abstracted still further. Now, the figures on the riding path itself are moving up the middle, right? You can make that part out. There's the black path with the figures riding along. We have another figure ecstatic in the landscape, in the lower left corner, arms out to the side. But then we have these other forms that are coming up through the landscape, erupted, right? These bits in here, which, if we look back at other images, become horses' necks and heads. Do you see that? Working its way up through the center. So he's pushing beyond the realm of representation and hoping that by repeating it and repeating it, he's now finding within it, as an artist, that same effect that the repeated word has, right? He's discovering the spiritual resonance, right? The spiritual vibration. And as they become increasingly abstract, he drops titles that reference the world as well. So instead of something that's called, Riding Path or lyrical, or two figures before red, two riders before, just composition. And the titles that he chooses for these abstract compositions, sometimes composition, sometimes improvisation, they're musical titles. Right? There were titles that were used more often for music at this point in history than for art. And what he's hoping is that this now becomes that spiritual vibration that one might feel from music, where inside you feel something even though there's nothing represented. Right? It's just the sound. Now we can still see figures on horseback, a couple of figures on horses leaping forward. We can still see our figures that look like ancient figures now bearing gifts, perhaps, right? A figure down here sitting up in the corner that we've seen in some of the other prints, but we're abstracting it away. We're pulling it away from what we've seen into something significantly less recognizable.
And the point is that once we leave the world behind, we can finally focus on the spirit. Right? Because as long as we're stuck in this world, it's very difficult to focus wholeheartedly on the next, on the spiritual realm. This is why monks go to monasteries, right? Is to get away from the world to focus on God, right? Lowercase g, right? However one wants to conceptualize that which is greater than us, that which is not physical. Some of the motifs seem to come from these praying figures that appear in these as well. There's still horsemen, lower right corner, right? But we have these Russian praying figures that go back to the idea of Russian folklore. There's a woman in the lower right corner, looked like the one that we saw in the black and white print, staring sort of more or less directly out at us. But with these figures, he sort of takes the same trajectory through the course of the book. And again, the pictures in the book are not laid out in the way that I'm laying them out. So it's not as simple as that. It's not like you just go, oh, let's take 3 steps from recognizability to abstract, right? They jump back and forth so that you start to see things differently, right? The size of the prints on the page vary, but you can see some of the figures now translated into more abstract forms in different parts of the composition along the right here. And again, as he moves through, those figures become increasingly abstracted, but these become forms that we see everywhere in his art. These fingers coming up that are in fact these holy figures from Russian folklore, from Russian religious history, if you will. None of them specified, right? They're not going to tell you that this is Saint Basil, right? Basil, or any figure like that. That's not the point. The point is the reference it makes to figures who strive to think past the physical world to something better and more spiritual. So this is the key to what he's doing in painting, right? This is up in the Guggenheim. So when we look at something like this, which it might at first seem pretty abstract, having worked our way through sounds, through Klänge, we can now begin to say that's not so abstract after all. That a lot of it is recognizable to us. A figure on horseback leaping upward, that large disembodied horse's head that we saw in the riding path, the standing figures in the lower left corner. Doesn't in the far lower left corner, the thing that looks like it's coming out of an alien pod look like, we've seen these pictures because of the NFL things, right? But the 3 Olympic athletes in 1972 or 68, that when they got the 2 Americans, when they got their medal, they gave the Black Power salute. Have you seen this photo? It's the Olympics of '68, I think it is, in Mexico City, and we came in first and third, right? Gold and bronze, and they did and put their heads down, and that's the figure down there. It's a symbol of sort of in defiance and triumph, you know. And the lower right corner, right? There's a figure that we see sort of now leaning up, right, over here, coming up out of, and these are all charged, loaded themes, right? Praying figures moving in mass, a figure erupting from a pod with their arm outstretched, a figure rising from what looks like a tomb. These are all transcending the bonds of the physical world. A horse leaping up, a figure in yellow reveling in the landscape, right? These are all themes that are rich with mountains, right? Rich with metaphoric content, right? And again, as he works these and reworks them, we still see the themes there, but they get increasingly abstracted, right? Towers on mountain tops, figures that look abstracted from standing figures, sometimes perhaps even horses. For example, the long neck in the middle now becomes these 2 straight greenish bars with the orange dots in them. The thing to realize with Kandinsky is when we get to works of art like the one on the left that are increasingly less recognizable, every aspect of these, even, these, looks like the Star Trek symbol in the old Captain Kirk here, there, Starfleet Command or Federation, right? They have a basis in something that he's seen, that he's pulled it away from, so that instead of thinking of the world, we think of this spiritual resonance that either form or color has, right? I really love Kandinsky. I think he's just fantastic. And the career, the stuff that happens later is great. Over in the Phillips, and by the way, when he gets big, this one on the left, right? I gotta look it up because it's yeah, it's 8 and almost 9 feet across the base. The one on the left is, right? So he's making big statements with these pictures, right? It's in Dusseldorf, right? So you're not going to go see it anytime soon. But he's working toward these sort of statement pictures, right? By running through the sketches to get himself there. The one in the Phillips on the right is relatively small, right? It's, I don't have the dimensions, but if I remember correctly, it's about like yay across, right? So it's one of the more small studies, but you can see based on the chronology here that he's not moving in a single direction. It's not like every work is one more step toward being abstract, right? Because he sees these abstract forms as having a root in the world around us, and his job as a painter is to elucidate, right, to clarify the connection between our world and a greater spiritual existence. So we'll step back sometimes and look at something else, right? So this picture, what's he illustrating here? What is this a picture of? Can you read it? Can you see anything there? Mary? Go ahead. There's definitely a reflection, right? So across this line that runs diagonal here, there's definitely a reflection because there's too many things that repeat here and here, right? So it suggests probably what? Along a lake or a river, right? Some sort of body of water. And that shrub we see is probably the shore, right? That yellow or the green squiggle line is probably the shore, right? So what else do we see that we can maybe pull out of this? Are there parts that remain recognizable? Margaret?
The thing with the triangle on the left-hand side, the whole...
This bit here?
No, that whole...
This bit here?
Yeah, it kind of looks like a church or even like a... I don't know. It looks like a building.
Almost. I think the thing in front of it definitely does. Like there's a tower there,
Yeah.
right? And I think if we look back through his works, we find things that are tower-like motifs often in his works, such as this one here on the right, left. I wonder, do you think that's a building behind? We have that tower-like motif, and the thing that's behind them. Do we agree that that's maybe a building, or does anybody have any other ideas? A mountain. We've seen blue mountains before in Kandinsky's work, and mountain as a metaphor for ascension. So I'm wondering, Margaret, if we don't have a sort of mountainous village, if you will, on the side of the river. We know where he painted this. There's a town. I think I might have the name coming up. Let's see. I don't. Murnau. It's a little village outside of Munich. So Munich, anybody ever been to Munich? Where is Munich? It's in Germany, but where in Germany? It's right by the Black Forest. It's right at the edge of where the flat part of Germany turns into the Alps. So you get outside of Munich by like 15 miles, and you're on the foothills of the Alps, right? So I've never been to Murnau, right? You know that, you've ever seen these photos of that crazy castle in the hills? The German castle, it looks like Disneyland. That's, what, 15 miles from Munich maybe? Or so, it's just outside. It's a real quick train trip. I went there, right? I didn't go to Murnau. So this idea of these mountains that just begin to just jut up like that is, in fact, that's the landscape around Munich. Not in Munich, but around it, right? And that's what he's painting here, I most certainly think, right? So I think there's a combination, Margaret, of religious architecture, definitely. But the confusion is key because the world is religious architecture for him in a way, right? It's this structure in which he sees other things. And so that series of mountains opens up to sky in the background, right? We have these colors that he's adding in, but if we look on the far right, right, upper right corner, the colors have become disembodied, right? They're not trying to describe really anything whatsoever there. And even some of them, you get the sense, if we think back to our Orphist painters, that he's painting sound as well, isn't he? In the way this green line comes out, the way these blast out from the side in a sort of wavy pattern as well. That he's trying to evoke a resonance in the sound, right? I think we won't get into this quick, but he's painting this at the same time he's preparing this book. In addition to the book of poems that we saw, Sounds, in 1912, at the same time he's also doing writings. Kandinsky's really prolific. And a very short book, it's only about 100 pages long, plus illustrations, concerning the spiritual in art. And this is the original 1912 cover. And you can see that even with the 1912 cover, there's this amalgam of sort of horse-like motifs, where the semicircle becomes the legs, and then the neck comes up on the right, but within it you start to see other things that look like forms we've seen, right? This crusade against complacency, this crusade against the physical world. But in this book, right, in Concerning the Spiritual, he writes about color. And we've so far talked about the fact that he tends to distill form, shapes, down to where they are spiritual symbols, right? But for him, color has a spiritual component as well. And that every color has a very particular spiritual component that's derived from where he saw it in nature. We talked about this with blue, right? Blue is deeply spiritual to him. But other ones are references to other emotions that will resonate within us because of our experience, and his job is to figure out that resonance without the representation. Now, it's 1:45, so I don't have time to start. We'll pick up with this on Tuesday with him, and I will be I'll be redistributing your expressionism essays. Probably, I've got some things booked this afternoon, so it's either going to be later tonight or first thing in the morning. I'll be giving hunters to somebody else and vice versa, right? Does that mean you haven't sent me yours yet? Okay, well, get it to me today, okay? Those of you who haven't yet, because I'll be sending that out first thing in the morning, I hope.
Kirsten in the hallway, and I completely forgotten that I said I would do the walk with her.
Oh, okay. Well then,
And I said, I'm going to the museum. She went, oh, that's the only reason why I'm going to the walk. So,
okay. So stay and do that then.
is that right?
No, that's all right. Well, here, let's just got to record.